The production dashboard was green, every metric where it was supposed to be. My little custom alert bot, the one I'd spent 3 weekends building from scratch, was sitting quietly in the corner of my Slack sidebar, its status emoji a tiny wrench. Just a wrench. Meaning, everything's fine. I've got this. Go home. I went home. I didn't know that was the last normal Tuesday I'd have for a long time. My name is not important right now. What's important is that I was, for 6 years, the lead UX designer at a mid-sized SaaS company based out of Austin. Not a startup anymore. Past that phase. But not yet the kind of company that has a chief brand officer with a podcast and a signature blazer. We were in that awkward middle, growing fast, hiring faster, trying to look like we had our act together, while quietly panicking about Q3 projections. I was good at my job. Not in the way people say that to sound humble before listing their accomplishments. I mean it literally. I was good. I had built the entire design system from zero. Every button, every color token, every interaction pattern that lived in that product had come from me. I had written the brand guidelines. I had designed the onboarding flow that, according to the product team's own numbers, cut drop-off rate by 34% in 18 months. I had done this while training 2 junior designers, sitting in 140 meetings about aligning on vision and surviving 3 rounds of executive reorgs. What I had not done, because it never occurred to me that I would need to, was document who owned what. That oversight almost cost me everything, and then it didn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The new CMO arrived in February. I'll call him what my former coworker started calling him after his second all hands. The deck guy. Because every single idea he had arrived in a 40-slide PowerPoint with an executive summary slide at the front that said things like synergizing brand velocity and emotional resonance at scale. I'm not making that up. Emotional resonance at scale. That was a real slide. The deck guy had come from a large consumer brand. The kind of company where design is a massive department with sub-departments. Where you have people whose entire job is to manage the people who manage the font library. He had opinions about aesthetic, strong ones. He used the word premium approximately 11 times in our first meeting and never once defined what he meant by it. He looked at our product, looked at the design system I'd built, and within 3 weeks of being at the company, had already described it to the CEO as dated. I found out because our CEO, who I genuinely liked, who had hired me, who had sat with me through late nights when we were still figuring out what the product even was, forwarded me the email with a note that just said, "Wanted to loop you in. Let's talk tomorrow." The email from the deck guy said my design system lacked contemporary visual language and failed to signal innovation to enterprise buyers. He had included, as evidence, screenshots of 3 competitors' websites. Not their actual products, their marketing websites. I stared at that email for a long time. Then I wrote back a very professional response about how marketing sites and product UI serve different purposes, and that enterprise buyers evaluate usability, not splash pages. Our CEO said, I made great points. Then he told me the deck guy would be taking a more hands-on role in brand direction going forward. He said this like it was a gift, like I should be relieved someone was coming to help. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself this for 4 months. During those 4 months, the deck guy brought in an outside agency, a boutique firm from New York that specialized in brand transformation for B2B. I'll call them the agency. They had a beautiful website, a case studies page full of logos I recognized, and an Instagram account that was mostly photos of their open plan office and their team retreats in Portugal. The agency was given access to everything: our brand documentation, our design history, our user research archives, all of it, including the 40-page brand strategy document I had written 2 years earlier, which included our positioning framework, our typography rationale, our color psychology breakdown, our tone of voice guide. I was not told this was happening. I found out when our junior designer mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd spent the afternoon doing a file export for someone she'd never heard of. I asked the deck guy about it. He said the agency needed context before they could begin reimagining the brand experience. Reimagining, I said. Refreshing, he said. Evolving. I went back to my desk. I opened the brand strategy document in question, and I noticed, for the first time, something I had never thought to check. The document had been created in my personal Figma account, not the company's organization account, mine. Because 3 years earlier, when I had started building it, we didn't yet have a company-wide Figma license, and I had just used what I had. I had then shared it with the team, invited everyone in, and we'd all just worked there ever since. Nobody ever moved it. Nobody ever talked about it. It existed in my account the same way a tool lives on a shelf in someone's garage. You use it, you don't think about it, you don't ask who technically owns the garage. But it was in my account. I closed the laptop and went for a long walk. 2 weeks later, the agency presented their brand evolution to the leadership team. I was in the room. I sat very still. Their deck opened with our positioning framework, the one I had written. The language was slightly adjusted. A word swapped here, a sentence restructured there. But the bones were mine: our 3-pillar brand architecture, our clarity over complexity messaging ethos, the specific metaphor I'd used about our product being like good infrastructure. You don't see it, but you feel it when it's gone. That metaphor was in their deck, on slide 7, with a slightly different font. Nobody in the room noticed. Why would they? Most of them hadn't read my original document. The deck guy beamed like a man watching his child perform in a school play. The agency was quoted $380,000 for phase 1 of the engagement. I smiled through the entire presentation. I went home that night and I did not sleep. Not because I was upset, though I was, but because I was thinking methodically, carefully, the way I think when I'm designing something, and I need to understand every constraint before I start. What did I actually have here? Here is what I had. The design system I had built lived in my personal Figma account. The design system included over 2,000 components. It was the single source of truth for the entire product. Every engineer on the team pulled from it. Every new feature was built on top of it. Every screen in the product referenced it. The company had been operating on top of this system, from my account, for years. They had not asked me to transfer it. We had never discussed ownership. There was nothing in my employment contract. I checked that night, reading the whole document for the first time, that specifically assigned design assets created in personal accounts to the company. The IP clause covered work created using company resources and equipment. My Figma account was not a company resource. It was mine. I had been paying for the subscription myself until the company started a reimbursement program. But even then, the account was mine. I also had the brand strategy document and 3 years of UX research and the icon library I had built separately and uploaded, and the design tokens file that the engineering team used to maintain visual consistency across both web and mobile. All of it was in my account. I called a friend of mine who had left a startup 3 years earlier and ended up in a legal dispute over exactly this kind of thing. She gave me the name of an IP attorney in Austin who specialized in creative and digital work. I made an appointment for the following Monday. The attorney, I'll just call her my attorney, had the energy of someone who had seen this particular situation before and found it interesting. She asked me very precise questions. She looked at my contract. She looked at screenshots I'd taken of the Figma account structure. She asked about how the files had been shared with the team, who had admin access, whether the company had ever explicitly asked me to transfer ownership. The answers were, from my account, just me, and no. She leaned back and said, "This is a gray area, but it's a gray area that tends to favor you." She explained that gray areas, in practice, mean the outcome depends on who documents their position first and most clearly. She told me that if I wanted to pursue a licensing arrangement, which was one option, I would need to establish in writing that I was the account owner and that commercial use of those files was subject to my authorization. I asked what that would look like. She explained the structure. Usage licensing fees for creative assets are not standardized the way software licensing sometimes is, but they're not made up either. They're based on scope of use, revenue of the company, duration of use, and exclusivity. A design system of this scope, used by a company of this size, generating this much revenue, used commercially for this many years without explicit agreement? She named a range. I wrote it down. I did not tell anyone at work. 3 weeks later, I was let go. The deck guy gave me the news in a conference room with a glass wall overlooking the open plan office. He said the company was repositioning the design function and that they had decided to centralize creative direction through the agency partnership. He said my role had become redundant in the new model. He used the word redundant 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted. He seemed nervous. He had a printed sheet of talking points in front of him that he kept glancing at, which meant HR had coached him, which meant they were worried about something. I thanked him for his time. I collected the items from my desk, which were minimal, because I'm not someone who decorates my workspace with a lot of personal items, a habit which now struck me as accidentally useful. I turned in my keycard. I did not, however, immediately revoke access to my Figma account. My attorney had advised me to wait, to document, to let the usage continue while I build the paper trail, because every day of ongoing commercial use without a license was a day that strengthened my position and, depending on how we structured this, added to the calculation. So I waited. I went home. I made a lot of coffee. I took very long walks around my neighborhood and listened to podcasts about things that had nothing to do with design or SaaS or the deck guy. I called my mom. I reorganized my kitchen. I was quiet about what I was doing, which is different from doing nothing. Every few days, I'd check the Figma account analytics. You can see, in Figma, which files are being accessed, when, and by whom. The design system was being opened daily. The engineering team was pulling components. There were new edits being made, someone trying to modify things, adding new frames, building on top of the existing system. The agency had been given viewer access at some point too. I could see their email addresses in the file. I documented everything. Screenshots with timestamps, access logs, the dates and nature of each interaction. I kept it in a folder on my personal computer, organized by date, the way you keep evidence when you know that is exactly what it is. My attorney sent a formal letter, a licensing inquiry, technically, to the company's legal department 6 weeks after my termination. The letter explained that I was the account owner of the Figma workspace in which the company's core design assets resided, that I had not authorized commercial use of those assets following the termination of my employment, and that we would like to open a conversation about formalizing the arrangement. The letter was very calm. It did not use the word lawsuit. It used the phrase licensing arrangement. It was polite in the way that a letter from an attorney is always polite, which is its own kind of language, one that everyone in a legal department recognizes immediately. I know, from a friend who still worked there, what happened when that letter arrived. The deck guy apparently did not know until that moment that the design system was in my account. He had assumed, as most people assume, that company stuff lives in company accounts. The discovery that the entire product's design infrastructure was sitting in a personal account belonging to the person he had just made redundant apparently caused a very specific kind of panic. The VP of engineering had to explain to him, slowly, what a design system is, what it contains, and what would happen if access was suddenly revoked. The answer to that last question was a significant portion of the development team would not be able to do their jobs. Active features in production were referencing live components from this system. The mobile app had 16 screens being actively rebuilt using component libraries from my account. The agency's work, also built on my system. Their brand evolution was being applied on top of an infrastructure I owned. My attorney described the situation to me like this. You have the keys to a building they've already moved into and started renovating. I thought that was a very good way to put it. Negotiations were not fast. They were not pleasant. The company's legal team initially pushed back on the premise. They argued that the IP clause in my contract covered the work regardless of where it was stored. My attorney had anticipated this. She had pulled the exact language 3 times, and there was no clause that said, regardless of account ownership, or including assets in personal accounts. The clause covered work done on company time with company resources. She was very good at explaining why a personal Figma subscription billed to a personal credit card with a personal login was not a company resource. Their next argument was implied consent, that by using the account for company work, I had implicitly authorized the company's use indefinitely. My attorney's response to that was essentially, implied consent does not survive termination of the employment relationship without a written agreement, and the company had terminated that relationship. The termination, in fact, was what had created the problem. Their third argument was that the damages were speculative. My attorney handed them a licensing valuation from a creative IP consultant she had brought in, who had calculated fair market licensing fees for a design system of this scope based on industry standards, revenue of the company, and duration of post-termination use. The number was not small. Here is where I want to be precise, because when I've talked about this with people, the math always confuses them if I'm not clear. The base licensing calculation covered two things. First, retroactive commercial use, meaning the period between my termination and the date of their formal response, during which they had continued using the assets without authorization. At standard design licensing rates, multiplied by the scope of use and the company's annual revenue bracket, that period came to a specific number. Second, the brand strategy document and research archives, which the agency had used as the foundation of their $380,000 engagement without attribution or licensing. My attorney had a separate calculation for that. The standard for creative strategy work used commercially without licensing is typically a percentage of the downstream commercial value. In this case, a percentage of the agency's contracted engagement fee, plus a claim against the company for enabling that use. When you add those together, and then add the standard legal fees recovery clause my attorney had included, the total demand letter came to just under $1.1 million. The company came back with a counter. We went back and forth. I will not pretend this was comfortable. It was not. There were moments where their attorney sent emails that were designed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable, and I had to remind myself what my attorney had told me at the beginning. The gray area favors whoever documents first and holds their position. I held my position. The final settlement was structured as a combination of a lump sum and a licensing fee for continued use through the end of their fiscal year, after which they would need to either renegotiate or migrate their design assets to their own accounts, a process my attorney ensured would take them considerable time and resources. I'm not going to give you the exact final number because the settlement has a confidentiality clause. What I will tell you is that I no longer have to worry about the next 18 months. And I bought myself a very good chair for my home studio. The deck guy was gone by the following spring. I know this not because I was watching, but because two people who had worked with me reached out within the same week to mention it, which is the workplace equivalent of someone quietly sending you a news clipping they think you'll want to see. Apparently, the brand engagement with the agency had not delivered the results that had been projected. Enterprise buyers had not responded to the new visual language in the ways the deck guy had anticipated. There was also, I understand, some internal friction around how the design system migration was handled. It turned out that rebuilding years of infrastructure from scratch was, as I could have told anyone who asked, not a quick project. Nobody asked. He was let go. The reason was listed internally as restructuring. I'm told it was one line in a board update, not even its own bullet point. There is a version of the story where I'm angrier, where I describe every slight in detail, where I let you feel every minute of sitting across from the deck guy as he told me I was redundant while I watched him glance at his talking points. I could write that version. But honestly, that's not what I remember most. What I remember is walking out of the settlement meeting with my attorney and standing on the sidewalk in downtown Austin in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, squinting in the sun. I remember thinking about how I had built that design system over 6 years, component by component, decision by decision, with a lot of care and a lot of late nights, and a genuine belief that the craft mattered, that making things work well and look right and hold together, that it mattered even when nobody was paying specific attention to it. They paid attention eventually, just not in the way any of us expected. I started my own studio 6 months after the settlement. It's small, just me and one contractor right now. We work with companies who want design systems built right. I document everything. I am, perhaps unsurprisingly, very thorough about contracts. Every file lives where it's supposed to live. Ownership is clear. Licensing terms are written out before anything starts. And somewhere in Austin, I'm told, a product team is still slowly migrating components, rebuilding from scratch what took me 6 years to build, getting about 60% of the way there, and then realizing they've introduced inconsistencies that cascade in ways they don't yet understand. Infrastructure is invisible until it isn't. That's the thing about building systems. People forget they're standing on something. They forget until the day they're not. The wrench is still the emoji I use when everything's fine. Some habits you keep. There's a version of yourself that exists before something like this happens, and a version after. I don't think I fully understood that until I was standing on a sidewalk in Austin on a Wednesday afternoon, squinting into the sun, holding my phone in one hand and thinking about nothing in particular, just standing there, breathing. The thing about being told your work is dated by someone who never once sat with the people using it, who never watched a new user try to navigate a product for the first time, who had never built anything from zero, is that it goes somewhere in you. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, like a splinter you can feel but can't quite reach. I think about what I could have done differently, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Not much. I could have documented ownership earlier. I should have. That part's on me, and I've made peace with it. But everything else, the way the deck guy dismissed 6 years of craft without curiosity, the way the agency used my strategy document as scaffolding for their $380,000 engagement, that was a consequence of choices they made. Actions have weight. That's not a philosophy. That's just how things work. What I know now, more than anything, is that the work you do in quiet, the kind nobody praises in all hands meetings, the kind that just holds everything together, it has real value, measurable value, market value. The error I made was assuming that because nobody was tracking it, it didn't need protecting. Treat the way real intelligence isn't just about being good at your craft. It's about understanding the world your craft lives in. Contracts, ownership, leverage. These aren't cold, cynical things. They're how you protect what you built. I also learned something about timing. My attorney told me early on, hold your position. It is very hard to hold your position when you are scared and out of a job and watching someone else take credit for your work. It requires a particular kind of resolve that I didn't know I had until I needed it. The waiting was not passive. Every day I waited was a day I was building something. A paper trail, a case, a future. It just didn't look like building from the outside. And here's the part that stays with me most. The deck guy had every opportunity to understand what he was dismantling before he dismissed it. He chose not to. He walked into a system that someone had spent years making careful, and he called it dated without ever asking how it worked. That incuriosity, that arrogance dressed up as vision, is what created the conditions for everything that followed. Not malice exactly, just the ordinary failure to respect what you don't understand. I'm not glad it happened, but I'm not sorry about how I handled it either. I held my position, I documented what was mine. I let the legal process work the way it was designed to. And now I run my own studio, and every engagement starts with a contract, and every file lives exactly where it's supposed to, and I sleep fine. The design system I built still exists somewhere. Partially migrated, I'm told, with inconsistencies that cascade in ways they're still untangling. Infrastructure doesn't vanish just because someone decides not to see it. It just waits, patient and exact. Some things you build outlast the people who underestimated them. That's the only lesson I've got. But it's enough.